current boundaries, where maybe have we broken through those boundaries, and which boundaries do we want to make sure that we maybe remain open for kids, for educators, and for our school systems going forward. And so we think about learning without boundaries, whether it's for students, it's for staff, it's for ourselves, or even leading without boundaries and thinking about not only what's kept us in place, but maybe places that we can break through and grow forward, is sort of a theme. And it started with just this theme, really just started with us just imagining how we can continue to go forward and not go back. And we'll get into that here a little bit today. Logistically, this is my name, Ryan Crone. I'm, like I said before, our superintendent actively right now. I've done a lot of different roles in education and outside of education in terms of transformation consulting. But most importantly, I sort of identify myself as a learner and look forward to what each day is going to bring and how we can learn, and more importantly, how we can create really powerful learning systems. Twitter handle at the bottom, we're a great spot to share ideas with one another after our session. I mentioned the three-part series here today, the learner, the learning, and the learner-centered ecosystem, and we're going to be rolling through that. And when we get into each section, you'll see how they do connect, and there's a strong interconnectivity between all three sections, but we break them apart to begin and get a little bit deeper into each one. Next piece here, just a couple of things tools that we'll use today. The first one really is by choice. Christina will be sharing this with you in the chat box, but it's a reflection form. And this form will look at all three parts on just one page, but then we also have an individual reflection page that we will reference for part 1, part 2, and part 3. So that's all in one document. And it really just sort of guides some of the main ideas. The concept of really just a plan on a page is simple. It's to take the most powerful notes and ideas we can, but to also hold ourselves accountable to what steps and action steps we can take following up here, and just keep our thoughts rolling as we will progress through some of the ideas today, sometimes quickly, or sometimes you won't have a chance to fully think about them, but want to make some notes to go back to them. The other tool that we're going to use today is Jamboard, and that's going to allow today to be pretty interactive in terms of sharing ideas and thinking and seeing what everybody else in the audience is thinking. We have a number of people that are in our session today and will be jumping in and out throughout the day, but this gives us a chance to really capture the ideas from this morning and build on those as we go forward. So if you're not familiar with Jamboard, again, Christina will share the link with you, and I'll have slides that we will click and go to the Jamboard experience, and it'll become interactive. So for today anyway, we'll use the Jamboard tool. We'll also use the chat material, and Christina will be here if there's any connection issues in terms of what you're having. With that being said, we're going to dive right in here this morning and get started with the first question. A little bit of a get to know you question, but in terms of the world we live in right now, one that's been disrupted a little bit with COVID, just a simple question to get going today that we'd like to practice Jamboard with, and it is, when things get back to normal, and I'm going to mention normal as in parentheses here, one thing I look forward to doing is, and so whenever you see a slide like this and there's a Jamboard link, we're going to go to the Jamboard section, and it's going to open up our slide 1. And you'll see a very similar looking piece here. And if you've never used Jamboard before, and I hadn't until this week, it's an interactive tool that allows us to go over here and click on the notes, and we get a sticky note. We can write in our answer and save it, and it'll show up on the board. So I put a couple samples up there already, and we can move them around. So what we're going to ask you to do is get a chance here, just take a minute to practice Jamboard, because we're going to use this multiple times here this morning and today. And we're going to ask that you can take a look at Jamboard and try to share a little bit about this question. When things are back to normal, one thing I look forward to doing is, and it could be anything and everything. If you want to put your name on there, that's fine. Or if I just put an example out. We figured there'd be just a little startup time with Jamboard. Lance is in the lead. Thank you, Lance, for getting us started. We want to make sure this tool works. Starting to see some themes here. Thank you. Some going places or seeing people. Looks like the tool's working for everybody as well. Feel free to add more than one, but I did ask one thing you're looking for, but. Somebody's doing some previewing of our session today by talking about using tech in the classroom, not because we want to, not because we have to. Nice. Going to some events. Thank you. We're gonna do about 30 more seconds. Got a final thought in here. All right. Thank you for sharing those. And as you can tell by some of the answers and some of the, not even answers, just some of the responses, some of the first things that come to our mind when we think about going back is getting back to some of the things that are really a part of our life, whether it's work life, personal life, family life, whether it's part of our community, whether they're interests and connections. You see some real themes of going places, being with people, having a chance to have, a sense of closeness to those that are in our life, and pieces like that. So I really, the goal of thinking about this is that behind each sticky note here on our page is a chance to think about what we value. So on the surface level, for example, the example I put in was getting a chance to go to a sporting event, which I do enjoy going to events and games, and whether it's for my own children or whether it's around the area. But it's always the moment when you think about it was of being with the people that you're with, whether you're having dinner beforehand or getting a chance to have conversation or having an experience with each other. And so you look at back behind the things about what are some of the things that we've been not allowed to do during this time. And really more importantly, when we get a chance to go forward, what are some of the things that we're looking most forward to? So thank you for also passing our Jamboard test here, because we're going to be coming back to this multiple times here this morning. Going back to our slide deck here in terms of our presentation, and thinking about some of those questions, one of the things that we're talking is, in our session today is we often hear sometimes when this is done, we're going to get back to normal. And now we've talked about that with our own personal lives, but we're going to shift the gears obviously into the world of education and schools and learning here today with the second Jamboard activity. And in this one, what we're going to be talking about is when we talk about, often hear people saying, we can't wait to get back. Across different states, different districts, you'll hear about people that have been in a face-to-face model with a number of restrictions or mitigation steps. You'll hear about a number of districts that are hybrid or virtual, the different use of different tools. And sometimes you'll just hear, we want to get back to normal. And in many, many ways, I think all of us do from the list that we had just created. At the same time, there's also been some moments and some silver lining moments where we've just learned so much. And maybe that we can't wait to move forward. Maybe some new things have happened inside of our communities, inside of our relationships, in terms of our professional practice, in terms of some walls that maybe we have broken down and other things like that. And our goal today is to start to separate the two, so that not necessarily racing to get back in the assumption that just getting back everything was perfect, but at the same time thinking about moving forward. And maybe that's in the world of education. Maybe that's in how tools that we're using, as somebody had mentioned earlier today, whether it's about perspectives, whether it's about connectivity to families, whether it's about new opportunities for breaking down some walls or barriers that were there before. So one of the pieces that we've done is we have sort of broken out of a traditional model in many ways by now doing a lot of innovative approaches. But we've sort of dabbled into many of these innovative ideas. And we want to just think about this today. So if you wouldn't mind sharing, not from a personal standpoint, I'm sorry, not from your personal life standpoint anymore, but just something in the thing of something that you can't get back to normal. And what would that be? Or we've learned so much, I can't wait to move forward. We're going to go to the Jamboard tool on this one. And we're going to go to the second slide on Jamboard. So I would go to this one now. But basically, I can't wait to get back to normal. It's something that you're really looking forward to. And that might be some hands-on learning and collaborative grouping with kids. At the same time, we learned so much, we can't wait to move forward. And there's a couple examples in here. So we're going to get started again. We'll take about another minute or two. And we really want to think about what we're racing to get back to and be mindful of that. And also what we've learned so much about that we can't wait to continue to move forward. So we'll go a couple minutes on Jamboard and take it away. Another 30 seconds. Thank you, everybody, for participating. Thank you for sharing these. I think this is a really important activity as we start our session here today, is to really think about the concept when you hear, whether it's in the community, whether it's parents saying they can't wait for their students to get back to school, or staff, or us as educators, communities fighting for schools to reopen, and sort of the idea of getting back. At the same time, our industry and education has really been pushed to an innovative edge during this time. And there's been so many things that have occurred, so many teachers and so many students and so many families experiencing some of the tools that make learning, virtual learning, hybrid learning, and remote learning possible, that has added some additional value to the world. Not only to mention bigger picture ideas, what schools have done to sort of try to, with the digital learning challenges that we have here in Wisconsin, with our governor, one of the major themes for the year of 2021 is the year of broadband internet for the entire state. And the idea of really looking at some of the inequities that exist across our state in terms of access to not only the internet, but then in this case, it would be school and learning some of these tools. So these opportunities where we've done so much work in making sure students had the tools, and teachers are using so many of these skills and strategies that we're looking at, that we're really excited about it. This is a great question to ask, and it's being asked multiple times, not only in getting back, but people are starting to ask, what are some of the things we're gonna keep? What are some of the edges that we pushed past that are working? Who's the one student or two students or number of students who virtual learning or hybrid learning really, really worked for a variety of reasons, whether it was learning style, whether it was their own disposition, whether it was something that in their family situation that was really helpful for? Who are some of the students that some of the tools in terms of greater student ownership and agency really moved to the next level in understanding that they were sort of being nurtured as a powerful learner. And really, in many, many ways, with many of the steps that we took forward, is this something that we want to continue with in terms of not going back and just maintaining some sort of hybrid model and these digital connections that we want. At the same time, getting back had some of the most powerful smile pieces, including just seeing students smile. And we talk about some of the ideas of having students in school, so that interactive piece, that hands-on piece, that really that joy of a great noisy classroom and learning coming to life as a part of a network and a community. And those are, I think, many of the many big pieces that sort of been missed in this piece. But at the same time, as you can see, there's many of these silver linings that have an opportunity for districts. And right now, many districts are looking for that. There's some additional, part 2 today is going to get into some instructional practices that can continue, but there's a number of places where sort of grading and assessment or determining grades have just been flipped upside down to more competency-based, more portfolio-based, more performance-based than point systems. And there's just been a lot of models where just sort of schools in its own has been pushed to the edge. And that's going to be one of our concepts here today. Going back to our slide deck here, and again, thank you for a couple of Jamboards now. We want to set the tone for this. We're talking about 3 phases today. And when we talk about ideas like the ones I just said, one of the things I'm going to have you think about and reflect on is this something you already know about in terms of maybe going back and forward? Is this something that you're already doing? Or is this something that you're at a spot where at phase 3 of this, where it's just becoming of the way of business in your system? And for example, when we talked about continuing to use maybe some of the Google Classroom or digital tools that you've been using with students for learning now, and your staff has been using them, is this something that you're looking to go forward with and have those become a part of your system moving forward? Or is that something that you're not? And that's going to be just sort of an individual reflection today, this what we call our reflection continuum of where are you in the stage of knowing about some of these ideas, where are you at or your team is at in terms of doing some of these ideas, and where are you at or your school district at in terms of having these ideas become really a part of your system. So this image right here is a pretty big one. It's a mental model's boundary in terms of we do this or we don't do that. And if we rewind the tape to before last March, many, many organizations or schools sort of have their own boundaries for what it is that they do or that they don't do. And for example, here in a school, this is sort of the boundaries that we have is we provide school in this way. We have students that attend school in this way. We have policies that would frame things. We teach in a certain model. We offer certain classes in a certain style. And in many, many places, the big picture was many districts didn't maybe offer students with a choice of a virtual or a blended or a hybrid model, or they didn't necessarily have all students learning through a variety of mediums, whether it's Seesaw, Google Classrooms, or other tools and things like that. So a mental model, and a mental model is an explanation of someone's thought process about how something works in the real world. And for many of our parents, us as educators and students, our mental model has sort of been broken up in terms of COVID. But we're not a, whoops, that is not supposed
Ryan,
to happen.
we're seeing a very zoomed in version of your screen.
All right, hold on a second. Let's do this over. And my music started, I don't know why that happened.
All right, Ryan, never mind. It sounds like you're good for
How's that?
Others. You're good.
How is that? Sorry.
You're good.
Okay. Sorry about that, everybody. So the idea of sort of boundaries, and remember our title of Leading Learning Without Boundaries, is thinking about what were our boundaries in education, in our classroom for how we taught and how we worked prior to COVID. Many industries, in terms of this crisis that we have faced, has sort of pushed beyond their boundaries. Almost every industry in this case, from movie theaters, restaurants, fitness companies, real estate, shopping, gaming, banking, and manufacturing have all had a pretty significant shift in their work and their work life. And as they're thinking about going back, you have to ask yourself, will restaurants continue some of the curbside pickup? Will some of the companies that we have that have decided on virtual showings for real estate, for example, make that their norm to allow people with greater access to appointments and looking at house shopping? A company and a friend of mine that is an executive at a local company here in Wisconsin, they have been home working remotely. And the company, one of the larger companies in Wisconsin, is now redesigning their entire office space where once had cubicles and now turning many of the spots into collaborative spaces and team spaces, because they're anticipating more of their staff will continue to work remotely. And when they are together, they'll be coming together in more team-based collaborative meeting structures. Manufacturing has continued to push more of the 3D modeling. And as you know, some of the ideas of shopping and grocery shopping and restaurants and the apps. Now, the concept that's interesting is many of the tools that these organizations and these companies are using were here before the pandemic. For example, online shopping or grocery pickup or virtual opportunities or applications for fitness. But they've been open in a way that have greater access to people now. They've been pushed to sort of a new level. And they've really started to create a market share where almost everybody's experienced some sort of industry in a different way now, whether it's banking or whether it's fitness or whether it's some other companies like this. Now that more, rather than just being sort of an innovative approach, it's more sort of the norm in our society right now with many of these industries. And the exact same thing can be said for education. So we talk about it, the quote at the bottom about a crisis, where a crisis can be a catalyst or can speed up changes that are on their way already. It almost can serve as an accelerant. So while we're struggling with many of the challenges of COVID, at the same time, there's these moments where some of the things that these changes that are on their way have been pushed forward at an even faster rate. Where almost every teacher now and every grandparent is using Zoom or Google Meets or Family Connections, where many of the tools for Google Classroom and that allow students for interactive and remote learning have been pushed to the next level in terms of this work. So today in education, we're going to really thinking about, we talked about 3 parts, is we're going to talk about the learner, the learning and the learner center ecosystem, really under the ideas here today of where did we break through traditional boundaries of what we don't do and what we do, and where are some of those breakthroughs we want to continue to keep moving forward because they had promised before, but even now that we've seen more students do this or more schools do this, this is something that we want to continue. And that was really that first question that we asked of what do we want to keep doing or not doing. So today we're going to focus on the learner, and we're going to intentionally dial this first part 1, we're going to focus on the learner. I want us to really dial in on what this learner is and what we talked about. Because in many ways, we can look at it through the lens of what we talk about what's not working with this piece for virtual learning, or hear what students can or can't do. At the same time, our students have also shown us a variety of ways in which they can learn, in which they can control their own learning, and which they have overcome some of the challenges themselves. Today's concept, when we think about what we just showed, is really thinking about what idea A used to be and what idea B is going to become. And sort of the idea that when we were told that we're going to shut down during COVID, it really did transform our thinking. We're at a spot today where we have a transformed experience for all teachers and all students and all families and communities. And the thinking here is, how can we keep moving forward on some of these ideas to really a new transformed system, whether that's just with one idea, whether that's with a variety of concepts, instructional strategies, or into an entire system. This gap right here in this experience is what we've been living in for some time, where what we used to do was maybe more effective and efficient than what we started doing. But at the same time, we're starting to see some ideas jump up this double S curve into a spot where we're starting to see some value in it. We're starting to see some tools that will continue on for a while. And that's what we're going to get into. The same can be said about the learner. Our learner has transformed their own thinking about what it means to learn and be at school. They've been pushed into a model that they've had greater ownership and agency and control and greater freedom and greater challenges in their way, where they can get to a spot as a learner. Has a transformed experience. Now they might even transform the system themselves for how they learn and how they interact in their learning each day. I have 2 high schoolers that are technically even in my house here today. And I think about the fact that they've been in a face-to-face model, then a hybrid model, and in a virtual model. They're both virtual right now. Their entire experience has been transformed, but in many ways, I see some silver linings in terms of how they're interacting with their peers, with their teachers, how they're doing their work, what they're accountable for, and how they're managing schedules, days, and time. So this is sort of the idea of moving from idea A to B and recognizing the transition that's going to happen. And we'll come back to this at the end of today's or this morning's session. So one more Jamboard here as we start. And what I'd like you to do, if we can shift over to Jamboard. We're gonna go to the third one here today. I'd just like you to add as fast as you can your favorite feature or your favorite app on your phone that you would use. Favorite feature or favorite app on your phone. Give it about another 30 seconds. Thank you, everybody. We have Google Keep, Google Assistant, Google Podcast, speech to text, favorite feature or favorite app on here. Thank you for sharing that. Reason for doing that, and as you can see back on our slide deck here, is I had a picture of a map. And the idea here, in thinking about whether it's, we often hear about people using GPS, using their photos and sharing photos, using to get their news, whether it's through Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whether they're using their phone for their wallet, whether they're using it for organizational tools like a calendar or a list maker, or even text to speech and some of the things we put on. And the concept here of really thinking about this piece is the amount of at what point in time did you stop carrying your camera around because you could depend and rely on your phone to get images? At what point in time did you stop using maps in your glove compartment of a car because you could start to rely on GPS? At what point in time did you start to rely on Apple Pay or other pieces? It goes back to this idea of this double S curve of moving from idea A, which maybe be maps in a glove compartment, to B, which is GPS. And the idea of being able to depend on and rely on the tool that you have to add value to your life or efficiency to your life and other pieces. And I'm always quick to think about what we've replaced or stopped doing in terms of this idea, in terms of what we've just started doing and what that transition was. The early GPS in a phone, which didn't sync to a car, didn't really help you navigate from point A to point B. But the later versions became really synced with what we're doing. This idea of thinking about this transition on this slide of the double S curve really goes back to us thinking about what ideas we're going to talk about today. When we talk about the learner and all the power that that learner has in help learning experience, what was it that helped them to transition from sort of being maybe a passive recipient to an active participant? What are the things that educators have done? What are the things that we've done systemically to support that? And what are the things we can continue to do to move forward? So if we think about some of this idea and sort of the concept that we have right here today, we're going to jump right into the idea of the learner. We talked about a three-part series, but when we mentioned about building this series, we built it based on 3 imagined statements. As you can see on the screen here, our first one with about the learner is imagining that the learning environment amplifies each learner's natural curiosity and is designed around experiences that are culturally relevant, challenging, and support individual needs, strengths, and interests. When we move from that learner to the learning environment, we're going to part 2 today, we're going to imagine it, the active, personalized, and serve as a foundation for individual growth, creativity, and innovation. And finally, as we move into the system approach, we're going to talk about imagine if technology was used as an accelerant to the impact of an inclusive and authentic learner-centered ecosystem. So going back to the idea of our favorite feature on our phone and getting a chance to see what we use each and every day, we have to think back of not only how did we get there with the use of that, not only the feature itself, but what it allows us to do and the experience that we have with it, but how it works within our system of our life, whether it's with the internet, with the tools or other pieces. So I use the idea of using GPS on our phone to have us drive from point A to point B, the opportunity that we have to have that be a part of our experience of how we're working, but how it does sync with many other parts of our life. When we get into today, connecting each of these ideas, we're going to start with the learner here today, and we're really going to think about these great ideas, the great features that students have, and the opportunity that we have to be a part of building experiences for them and building a system built upon the learner. I'm going to go with one more Jamboard. And in this one, I'm going to have you pick a card and answer any of the 6 questions here on today. We have 6 questions based on an educator, from a career question, today's graduates, community, parent question, and a college question. I'm going to have you go to Jamboard again. You can pick any of the ones to answer. I'm going to have you put an answer over the top of that question, as you can see from the example here today. Example I put up is, what do you wish your learners would do? I put self-directed, put that over there. If you could answer any one of the 6, so even if somebody's answered it, you can answer it again. And we're looking to just get a quick response, a word or two, in terms of one of these 6 questions. Thank you, everybody. Go another 30 seconds. Feel free to answer a couple of them if you want. Feel free to keep adding. I'm going to start talking a little bit about some of the answers that you've provided, some of the responses. First of all, these have been questions that I've asked to community groups, schools, districts, to business leaders. In the work that I used to do, we used to ask people what they were looking for from our graduates, what people were looking for in hiring, what schools and colleges were looking for, what parents really wanted. If I started to move some of your answers around in many, many ways, when we talk about, for example, somebody put that, what does our community want? Those that are empathetic. I would imagine that answer would still work for parents. It would probably really work for what we wish our learners would do in terms of graduates, what we wish maybe students would have and teachers would think. And you'll start to see that many of these responses to answering one question started to answer them all. The interesting theme about that is that when I started thinking about answers, and I've done this hundreds of times with groups and saw many, many sticky notes, they all kind of had the same kind of responses that you have here in terms of looking at this. The answers or the responses, 90% of the time or more, always responded to what you've just done, which I would consider to be a response about the learner as opposed to the learning. And I'll say that again, the responses that you've provided to these questions here today end up really being about the learner as opposed to the learning. So if I were to move a number of those tools around and push them over here, are answers that we have provided about tenacity and being collaborative and being empathetic really start to define what we would consider to be a learner. What I don't normally hear in those questions are Spanish 2, nothing against Spanish 2, or high school biology, or getting a certain number on an ACT, or hitting their growth score with use of a MAP assessment or NWA assessment, or being at a certain reading level. And what's interesting about that is when I hear the narrative in school and I see state report cards come out and I hear about I often hear about the learning, our accountability to learning. But when I ask the other questions, right off the top of the cuff, 90% of the time or more, I see answers that you've provided today about the learner. And that's one of the most powerful pieces that I've had a chance to really dig into over the last number of years, is really separating the difference between the learner and the learning, and asking ourselves some really tough questions about, is our system designed to nurture a powerful learner while they're learning, or is our system designed to push learning at students and hope that they become a powerful learner with all of those other attributes that you had shared? I've been fascinated with this concept, and what I'm excited about is more and more schools are talking more and more about the learner and who they are, and a well-rounded learner at that. If I took your answers and started to categorize them a little bit more, what we'd start to find is that we probably are talking about a four-dimensional learner. And what's interesting about a four-dimensional learner is that it really matches well with this fourth industrial revolution that we found ourselves in. And we think about where we're at with COVID here today. We're at a spot where students, we know what we want them to know in our Spanish and history and language arts courses, but at the same time, their success is probably more based on the answers about themselves as a learner. Learning how to learn is a major dimension. Having strong character is a major dimension. Having strong skills is a major dimension in order to push into the knowledge. So in no way, shape, or form today in this part am I looking to discredit what they are learning. The idea here today is to think about a system built for the learner that they're drawing upon and using and developing these attributes or these dimensions while they are learning. And this is the talk about a learner. To take this one step further, remember, we went from very simple questions about just thinking, what do we want and what do we wish for, into really recognizing the difference between the learner and the learning. Moving to a spot where we break that down a little bit more and really think about some of these dimensions for the learner. And that what we're looking to go forward with is to think about how does this relate, how this relates into what we call a portrait of a graduate, or which is really a storyline of a powerful learner. This example on the screen is one from my own district. I spent the last year developing this with our community, and I used to do work in helping to develop these with other districts. It starts with powerful conversations and with simple questions, the very same 6 that I shared with you, where this image right now, and if you zoom in on it, gets at those 4 dimensions along the side, starts to break down some more specific pieces about empowered learners and communicators, but at the same time, still hitting our standards in terms of world-class college and career readiness and these contributing pieces. In order to make a visual and get to this spot, we had to have thousands of conversations about how would this be our North Star, how would it be community built, and how would it be learner focused. A detail of each of those quadrants was broken down by our community and by our teachers. And you'll see many of these bullet points were many of the same things that you had written in our questions today about developing, as we think about empowered learners, certainly learning how to learn and being responsible and resilient and advocating for themselves, or is thinking about themselves as a collaborative leader, showing care and sort of engaging with other students. We talked about sort of this idea of a portrait of a graduate, guiding our storyline formally about the learner. And not just asking questions intuitively about what we want for our school, but saying that this is what we believe is a powerful learner. And we push for sort of what did we want to know, what did we need to do, and what did we hope to become by having a portrait of a graduate out there. What we hoped to become was a system that understood that the experiences we created for students were powerful enough to develop these skills and promote them. In this work that we had done in terms of what we wanted to know, we looked across this landscape and said, who are our partners? And our goal was to sort of generate a list of who was our partners and who we partnered with in our school system, from parents to educators, to community leaders, to industry, to a number of other sources in terms of who, and our universities and tech and industries, was who are the partners and what were they looking for? We also looked at, when we built an idea of thinking about the learner, was who's our intended audience? And we really wanted to make a statement about who our intended audience was, in terms of, by creating this, we wanted our audience to be guiding every lesson. We wanted it to be our audience of our parents, of understanding what we were attempting to do in schools, and how it was no longer just about sort of accumulating information, but to be able to use it and bring it to life and developing a well-rounded learner. And the last piece on this portion of a graduate, or thinking about the learner, was about what are the intended benefits or the preferred state that we wanted to get to. As we talked about doing this work, we had to break down this storyline in terms of what we needed to do to move from our current state, what our educators and students would do with this portrait, and what work were we doing now that connected to this work. And that last question was sort of our fuel for the energy. Because if you look at what we were doing, we had bits and pieces of this happening randomly, and our goal in becoming a learner-centered system was to do it strategically. Over the COVID time with COVID, in terms of thinking about what boundaries we broke over, we had saw that students were in a position to have to advocate for themselves repeatedly. It wasn't as easy to see a student disengaged in a classroom than it was online. And we had to figure out how students could be able to be an active participant in their learning. Or when we talked about what we were doing now, we wanted to keep seeing some of these pieces. So in terms of a portrait of a graduate, and the reason I'm sharing this a little bit, was we took the storyline that we just did here today, and we asked thousands of people those same questions. You say thousands, but we did it through a survey, we did it through open forums, we did it at events with staff and parents to sort of build our portrait. The idea here was to shift to a more learner-centered system. For example, in asking the 1,000 people, we started to see surveys and themes that led to the development of that portrait. We also saw that our students, in terms of this work, was going to be about having students be more than a number. Many, many ways, every time we talked about students, it was about achievement levels. It was about students above a state average or below it. It was about students and their scores. It was about grades and other pieces like that. What we wanted to do was to build the narrative about looking at our students as a whole, looking at our system as being one of talent development, and looking at one of students as seeing the individual learner inside of each system, and how we would get there. And our last piece on this was really about a story about that we felt that the learner would drive the future, and more importantly, that they would drive their own future. And the storyline here was less about grades and having students leave our system feeling that they maybe what they were ranked and what grades they got, and more importantly about leaving our system or leaving the lesson or leaving a certain grade level and seeing themselves as being a powerful learner and having those attributes that would lead to success in the future. So I'm going to have you just do a quick little pause, right? And this is where we're going to go into some of your note-taking piece around the portrait of a graduate. There's been a couple of ideas that we talked about here today in terms of the difference between the learner and the learning, or in part 2 of this is just looking at the portrait of a graduate. And I'd like you to just think for a second, I just shared one specific example, but imagine a portrait of a graduate has become a part of your system. Or in another way to look at it, just imagine a real learner-centered model has become a part of your system. Could you write a powerful message about how it has transformed your system, and sort of be willing to share this as we go? So again, we're going to take a minute just to do some reflection because I threw a lot at you. We can use the reflective tool that Christina has shared just in terms of taking some notes. And really the idea here is to think about what you know about what we've talked about already today, what you're doing about what you've talked about already today, and what you hope to become. And this is sort of the idea about becoming. Imagine that you've gotten to the spot and writing a really powerful message in terms of what you see this work doing and where you see it going. I'm going to pause for a couple of minutes, and then when we come back, we're going to just do a little bit of sharing. If you want to start sharing in the chat, or if you're willing to unmute your microphone and share, we have a group size that we'll do that here in a second. So. about another minute of a reflective note taking. All right. So if anybody's willing to share just a reflective piece in terms of maybe a powerful message they see this adding to their system, or wants to unmute and just do some talking so that you don't have to hear me the whole time, that would be great. The idea here, and we're going to kind of come to this in a second, is that some of these ideas are really, they're natural to our thinking, but they might not be natural to the thinking of our families, to our peers, to our system leaders, to ourselves, and sort of bringing this forward. And so, as I mentioned before, the effort on the first part about nurturing a story about the learner was really making a shift in our system, because instead of talking about what students can't do in an online environment or the challenges that we faced, we saw it as something that we saw as essential for students to do in order to be able to become a powerful learner and navigate their own learning journey, whether that's in school or outside of it. We also talked about trying to add value beyond just the learning and into putting it into the learner as a way to drive our system. So I'm looking at the chat here for a second. If anybody wants to add something in there, or if anybody would like to unmute and just take it away, that'd be great. I'd just like to hear some thoughts if anyone's willing to share. Otherwise, we'll move on. I'm going to keep going then. Someone once taught me that once you hear the popcorn stop popping in the microwave, that it's going to burn if you wait too long. So I don't want to wait too long. I don't want to cut anybody off. This slide, though, that is up, sort of the knowing, doing, becoming part, is I think a really interesting piece for reflection. And so reflection, I call it the reflection continuum in terms of the ideas that you hear. Many of you are in positions to be coaches or administrators or teachers where you think about the teams that you're on, and the ideas that we share about this, is it something that you are continuing to think, what is it that we know about this? What is it we're doing about this, or what is it we hope to become? And really one of the key pieces on this, as I mentioned before, is we spent a year developing just an image and a storyline about the learner. We're probably going to spend the next 4 to 5 years making that our North Star and having it guide some of our work. We're going to go a little bit further here now into some of the ideas from once we got the portrait of the graduate. What does that mean in terms of our work for the learner? Understanding our learner was sort of our next piece. Now that we understood where we wanted to go and what a powerful learner looked like, we needed to make our system be really to allow us to be learner focused. We needed to get to a spot with a learner profile. Now you can Google learner profile and find a variety of options, whether it's just an individual profile for a learner inside of a kindergarten classroom, whether it's a larger learner profile built around students owning it and co-creating it with the teacher, or whether it has a whole nother piece in terms of that. Our thinking though of getting to know your learner is how well is your system getting to know the learner and having it be a co-created conversation about both the educator and the learner, and really thinking about who they are and what that system looks like. There's so many tools about learning inventories, about having students own their own data, having students understand how to do goal setting, but really also, as we talked about the portrait, seeing themselves and allowing their voice to come in, where it's data informed and we know where students are at, but it's also passion driven with goals and interests. Where the learner profile promotes inclusive environments and allows systems to pause and think about who it is they serve and how well they're serving them. And also it allows for drives informative instruction in terms of understanding a profile. So the difference between a portrait of a graduate is that's a community conversation tied to some larger themes about many of the things that we wanted and wished for. The idea of a learner profile is really understanding the individual, and more importantly, the individual understanding themselves. We think about this piece and thinking about nurturing a powerful learner, we have to really ask ourselves, what do we want to know about this learner profile? What do we need to do? And what do we hope to become? And this is really the idea of having each student sort of see themselves of being a powerful learner and allowing that to move forward in their work. A student coming into a classroom and starting to feel, even at a young age, that they aren't aware of their metacognitive skills or that meta learning where they know how to learn, can quickly start to identify as not being good at math or not being able to see the skills that they are going to have to use. And our goal is to think about these things. Even today with COVID, many students who are starting to take on a greater role in advocating for themselves, creating evidence and artifacts for their learning, finding ways to push forward in the learning environment, be able to use their voice in the learning environment, be able to have a greater choice. And we'll get to this in part 2 today, and maybe how they demonstrate their learning really pushes some things to the next spot. When we talk about a learner profile, one of the great things to do, and we're going to do this in Jamboard right here, is to think about what could be included in this. Now, you could have everything included and not get used at all. You could have 1 or 2 things being used, and they could be used frequently. And I say that by having a learner profile about students. Sometimes I've seen more time in developing a learner profile where it isn't become useful, and it becomes a task, versus what's the intent. And so the question 2 is what could be included, but when is this going to be utilized? By whom? Does it help for the learner? Is it a help for an educator? Is it help for planning? And sort of what are the intended benefits? So we're going to take a minute here to think about what you'd want to know as a teacher, or what you would want to know as a system leader about your students. And you could really narrow this down granularly to be thinking about a student in art class or in math class or in science. Or you could be thinking about it through the lens of a larger picture about where are we at in terms of our students' demographics, in terms of their overall achievement level and their overall interest and passion. So let's go to Jamboard here and get a little bit interactive about learner profiles. We just want to generate a list. I'm going to push forward here. Whoops, and it looks like I didn't have it created. So we're going to go to Jamboard 5. And why don't we just talk about this? I apologize for that. I did not have that updated, but we're going to have this page on 5B, Jamboard 5, and this will be ideas for what can add in a learner profile. Not seeing anyone come over yet. Here we go. Getting a couple in here. as we push on this and as we think about this in terms of a learner profile, the idea is how do we get to know our learners? In a high school setting, we get a chance to see maybe 4, 5, 6, 7 classes a day and batches of kids coming in. It can feel almost overwhelming to figure out how we're going to get to know students and how we know where students are at. In a smaller elementary setting, sometimes with a teacher with one student or one class of students, some of this work seems a little bit more manageable. The idea, though, is to think about a learner profile in the sense of how it can help a unit of study or a lesson, as well as how it can help long-term planning and goal achievement in terms of students. Oftentimes, whether it's through conferences or goal setting forums at the beginning of a semester or other pieces, sometimes a learner profile many of the tools. I've seen systems before that have pretty comprehensive learner profiles that go from year to year and student to student and allow for planning with students and families. I've also seen the opposite of that of learner profiles that become sort of a task that don't get used. Our idea of a learner-centered system is that they're utilized by the learner, by the educator, and allow for things. In this case, we talk about allowing students in terms of a learner profile to think about their goals or their interests or hobbies. During the shutdown, some of the biggest conversations that families have asked for were, would prom and graduation still happen? Would there be sports and activities? Would plays and bands and musicals still continue? Would there still be these events? Things that they said their students look forward to. At the same time, behind those scenes are many, many areas where students are representing things that they have in terms of interests and hobbies of being with their friends and strengths that they have in their learning. At the same time, in terms of readiness, ready levels across content areas, watching students select a just right book, understanding their level of reading, understanding some of their goals in reading in their writing pieces or not, or where they want to go, even into onward, allow students. And someone added here, areas of weakness that the student wishes to improve is just a powerful piece. How often do we pause in sort of this cycle in a learner-centered model to do this becomes something that we want to embed into our system or a learner-centered system? Many of the tools that we have today and that were being used allow students to have sort of an inventory, allow students to have greater voice and choice in not only what they're going to learn, but how they're going to learn it, and how they're going to demonstrate their learning. As we get into the learning side of this piece with how do we use a learner profile, the idea is to nurture this powerful opportunity for students to have greater ownership, voice, and control in the learning experience. At the same time, even greater ownership for who they are as a learner. So as we spent the first part about talking about a portrait of a graduate, getting a chance to talk about this next part and where we get a chance to see where we are with the learner is we get a chance to really make sure that they also know where they are as well. So the story here about sort of the learner profile is really similar to the portrait of a graduate, which is making sure that this is co-created. And co-created at the beginning of a lesson, beginning of a story, at the beginning of a history unit, or the study of something. Getting a chance or doing stories, making sure that when we get these opportunities to have a portrait happening, that there's a huge variety of voice and choice in the learning experience or with the learner profile, that the student gets to use these pieces, that they have a greater voice in their learning experience, whether that's, again, with many of the things that you've said. And the last piece is really a becoming story where there is a systemic dashboard. Local districts have really talked about students being more than a score, and they've allowed students to have a greater ownership rather than getting a report card in the mail. More and more students are doing students with demonstrations and exhibits of their own learning, presenting themselves through a portfolio and presentation model itself, allowing students to have a collection of their work published and storylines. A school that we work with here really allows students to sort of talk about themselves through their learner profile, but actually have it now as a part of their system and how they report out. It's Ronald Reagan High School that's an area that's doing this that we've had a chance to watch closely. But besides just a diploma and transcript at the end, they have a whole storyline about a learner profile of how students have contributed to that, which includes not only the learning, but their learner skills, and sort of that whole piece where the portrait of the graduate been brought to life by the learner profile. So not to confuse the two, but in terms of thinking about sort of the idea is the difference between the portrait of a graduate is that is what our North Star is, what we hope to become. The idea of slowing our system down into a learner profile is about recognizing the small steps we can take inside of our classroom today to get to know our students, so that they're not coming in a batch where we're not recognizing their gifts and talents, but we're coming in as a way to sort of be able to tap into those pieces for the learning experience and allow students to have greater voice, choice, ownership, not only for the learning, but for really seeing how that can play out. So an imagine piece here today, and we're going to have about one more section left on this first part, is again, we're going back to this idea of becoming, if we want this to become in our system, but to be able to, again, write a powerful message on your reflection sheet about how the use of a learner profile and recognizing this can help to transform your system. And what I would say is, again, the goal here is to think about the small daily interactions with students, but doing it systemically. So we talk about keeping it simple, in that you can do it tomorrow in a really powerful message, but making sure it's systemic, that it's done across the classrooms, it's done across year by year, and it's done in a way that students are able to benefit from this because it's essentially a part of your system. We use that simple, the acronym is going to stand for the systemic implementation of powerful learning experiences. And again, it's got to be simple enough to do tomorrow, but it's got to be systemic in that it ensures powerful experiences for students. So we'll take about a minute there to, if you want to jot some notes down before we go to our last part for this morning's session. All right, last part of our first session, we're going to get back into this S curve, and we're going to talk about, to become a learner-centered system, what is it that has to come to an end? What is it that we have to sort of transform, and what is it that we're looking to begin? Oftentimes this image, we're going to be thinking about, when we think about adding leadership for this learner environment, we want to think about how we do something at a level of practice to policy. So what can happen in terms of practice for teaching practices with students today and going forward, but how as a policy level can we make sure that that is part of our system? I mentioned before, our work on building a portrait of a graduate was designed at a policy level across our system to redefine what a successful learner looked like. While it still had the knowledge in there, it had the other pieces that we so often talked and cared about. But how did that come to life in practice in terms that it would guide some of our lessons today? We also want to talk about, in closing this first section out, is maybe able to start with the learner and making sure that we're taking local action. When I talk about local action, what we're talking about is the teacher planning tomorrow's lesson. Local action, and I believe, is the best way to allow this change to occur. And I think it's also where the best decisions are made. A science teacher in 7th grade thinking about their local action in terms of bringing these ideas to life is going to give you the best feedback about what's feasible and what's practical. That statement of feasible and practical was something that I've had to use as a superintendent each and every day this year in terms of what we're going to be able to pull off during this time of transition, seeing that for the first time our system is offering face-to-face and hybrid and virtual. And it's really what is feasible and practical in our work. But it also, at the same time, allowed me to push on to, at the same time, was what is it that our system, oops, sorry, there's a little noise in the background. At the same time, feasible and practical wasn't about stopping what we're doing, but it's about getting started and thinking about what is our local action that we can do today as we move towards these ideas towards tomorrow. But local action is an area, when you talk about innovation, it's this where our local users are, our educators and our students, and it's really where we're going to get a chance to see these ideas come to life. And then the last one is really making an alignment and thinking about what we want for the learner, but how does it align to the learning experiences that we have? And put a classroom desk in here and sort of in a row. Sometimes our system might be set up in a way that we're not allowed to have students interact. We're not allowed to have places where they have space or time in their schedule. We're then allowed to do some of these things. So as we think about bringing the learner profile together, is our schedule inhibit that? And while instead of using it as an excuse, our goal is to start to chip away at some of those ideas. So going back to where we started and thinking about we do this, we don't do that. One of our challenges here for this section this morning is to think about, as we think about the learner and think about where we're at, what are some of the boundaries that we've pushed beyond because of this, in ways that we've engaged with learners, in ways that we've allowed the learner profile to shine, in ways that we've valued and honored the learner profile in a way. Our systems across school districts have had a lot of barriers in terms of how we can better reach students, how we can better serve students, how we can better allow student voice, how our instructional strategies can be more inclusive. how we can allow many of these pieces that we want to do. And so our idea of understanding a portrait of a graduate is about the learner. Our idea of a learner profile is understanding about that learner as well. So here's sort of a final reflection piece for this section this morning that we're going to do some writing on at the end. But in what ways, and this is not to be negative about school systems, but what way has the system failed to serve the learner in terms of their experience? And at the same time, in what ways has the system, is the system learner? Again, we're back to returning back to normal or reimagining and moving forward and thinking about many of the ideas in terms of what maybe has happened differently in terms of what we're doing and how we better serve the learner because we know our learner profile or we have a portrait. So I want you to think about this piece in terms of, this goes back to our sort of what are we going to go back to and what do we want to keep going forward with. Some of you have mentioned about earlier continuing to use some of the technology processes that we offer some flexible options or some flexible tools and things like that. That's an area where we're serving the learner in a way that might be able to meet the needs of their family or a certain condition, or certain learning strategies being served in a way that's allowing students to have greater voice in the learning experience, or even in a spot where they're bringing some spots in. There are some broader social functions that every system is dealing with in terms of food and custodial care, in terms of safety, in terms of even the digital divide. I have heard phenomenal storylines about how making sure that students are getting materials and packets and homework and internet and pieces like that. And where there's other districts still trying to figure that out. The number of delivery and drop-off pieces to homes and things like that have really, I think, pushed education into understanding many of the services that were provided in school needed to continue to be provided throughout the community and find ways to find some of those solutions in terms of going forward. Lastly, another way in terms of just that we're serving students is thinking about an innovative mindset in terms of determining grades and flexibility and competency and other pieces like that. Again, the idea on some of these is to think about what are we doing now that we want to continue to move forward with versus versus moving back. And I'd like you to put that in the lens of this S-curve and sort of do some innovative writing on your own, which was, here was idea A, or something that we thought about with the learner before. It has now been sort of transformed because of COVID into a new experience. And eventually, what's something that you still want to maintain? So this could be for a math classroom. It could be for your school. It could be for the use of tools. I'll give a couple of examples. Through this process, our system did not believe that students should have a one-to-one device. We're one of the districts that did not have that. Some districts do, some districts don't. When we reached this spot, and our community had certain opinions about that, when we reached the COVID spot, there was some transform thinking about what students could or couldn't do with technology. But we did push quickly to find as many devices as we could to allow students to have a one-to-one device or some virtual tools. That was a whole transformed experience for our families. Moving forward, that's going to be a part of our system. And not only is that an instructional framework for our system, but it also allowed us to think about the learner's responsibility, their ability to manage tools, their ability to use tools such as Google Classroom, their ability to be on video calls. All of that was new thinking. It also sort of started to talk about what the role of the learner was. Could they manage some of their time on their own? Could they use some of the tools? Could they demonstrate some of their learning? Could they be in collaborative circles and be trusted with many things? The whole shift had kind of occurred in terms of our own expectations. 6 or 8 months ago, we didn't do that. It was something we didn't do in our system. It is something we do now. As a superintendent, it's something that we are pushing forward on and saying to ourselves, we're not going to go back. Not only are we going to maintain the one-to-one devices for students, but we're going to maintain the digital platform for learning in terms of tools such as Google Classroom or Seesaw. We actually just approved our calendar for the 2021 school year and have added virtual days to our calendar. That is a systemic piece because we felt that even if it's just a couple of days, that we wanted our students and families to understand that this is something that we're not going to go back from, but it's something we want to go forward to. In addition, with our learners, as we think about our learners, we wanted our students to see themselves as collaborative contributors to the environment. And we talked a lot about how they could contribute to the learning experience or how they could provide care for other students and things like that. So becoming a learner-centered system, we're thinking about the learner in our system and what we wanted. We wanted students to really see themselves as having a voice and having greater ownership of their learning journey. And we did that. So as we go back to this spot, and I just gave an example, we talked about our flexible environment continuing. We talked about putting in greater systems of support with our portrait of a graduate and thinking about these spots. We even thought more and more about how we can help with the digital divide moving forward and making sure that next year, as well as this year, we have connectivity solutions for all students and families in our system. And the goal was that we no longer wanted a barrier of whether students did or didn't, but it was something we wanted to make sure we were serving our students with and thinking about our learners having the skills to navigate this experience. Obviously, in this double S curve, in the learning versus the learner, we talked about a learning system with innovative technology, but now we're talking about a learner-centered ecosystem with innovative technology and helping our families, our community understand how these tools are transformative for learning, how they open up doors for greater connectivity, and how they allow the learner to be in greater control of their learning experience. So we're going to close today with what I call the rule of 3 versus your next email. We have about 15 minutes left in our session, and we're going to take some time here to do some reflective writing before we close. The idea of a rule of 3 is to overcome your next email. After today's session, you might look, or during the break, you might look at your next email and it might ask you to do A, B, or C. It might put you back into sort of the task list that we have to do in our daily lives in terms of the busyness that we have. But the rule of 3 allows us to really think about what we need to take 3 minutes right now to do some writing in terms of what you want to do in the next 3 hours, what you can do in the next 3 days, and what you can do in the next 3 weeks as it relates to some of the ideas that we talked about here today. Whether there's a concept, again, in the next 3 hours that you're thinking that you want to put some time into and build some time into resources, what's practical, what you might do in the next 3 days to move some of these ideas forward or find some of the work that you're doing, or what you might do in the next 3 weeks. It's a concept that we use in our building in terms of when we have staff meetings or professional development days, is to take our time to do a reflection in terms of, in today's first section was the learner, is where do we see opportunities to move forward? And where do we see, and where do you see getting back and why? And we'll go from there. But the rule of 3, besides the reflection, is to really think about bringing those ideas to life. So if you see an opportunity to move forward, what is it that you can do for that idea to move forward in the next 3 hours? It could be doing additional research. It could be planning out some time on your calendar to dig in. It could be spending time doing a little bit of connectivity with people on this call, and just getting resources and things like that. In the next 3 days, you might have a chance to have an initial meeting about some of these ideas, or make some connectivity, or the next 3 weeks. So when we talk about bringing things together, our goal and our rule of 3 is to make sure before we leave a meeting or a training that we take the time to plan out the next 3 hours, the next 3 days, and the next 3 weeks. And in many ways, our life is so busy, but we ask ourselves, if we don't have time to necessarily put even a couple of ideas on paper, when are we going to have time? So again, we're going to take about 3-4 minutes here to do a writing. And we're going to talk about, again, where do you see opportunities to move forward as it relates to what we learned this morning? Where do you see opportunities of getting back and why? And again, those were the things that you said, where you said we can't wait to get back, but you had some deep reasons why in terms of building good relationships. And what are some things that you can do? At 10, we'll take 5 minutes for this. So at about 10:23, I'll interrupt one more time, and Christina and I will do some questions and sort of some next step as we close out today's session or this morning's session. So we'll see you in about 5 minutes. Which again, this is on your reflection form, and it gives you a chance to just take some quick notes of an idea or two that you'll take from this morning. Well, one more minute and we're going to come out for some questions here. All right. Christina, I don't know if you want to come back on or we'll
Yeah.
go from there.
Thank you, Ryan, for a lot of thinking and reflecting and sharing of experiences that you've had as well. And I love all the connections. Just wanted to take a few minutes. And again, hi, I'm Christina Sprader. I'm the Director of Learning Strategies at EdTech Team if you joined after the start. But we have a few minutes left to spend some time asking Ryan some questions that might be related to a concept we originally started with, maybe something that you came in with today, a thought you had coming into today and it didn't get touched on, but you still would love to get Ryan's thoughts or the group's thoughts, or questions that we talked about, or questions on topics we talked about throughout. So questions, thoughts, comments, ideas, anything you'd like to share, feel free to add something in the chat or go ahead and unmute. We'd love to hear from some of you and how this connects with the work you're doing, or any experiences that you've had that might be good for others to hear as well. So the next 7 minutes are open to any questions or anything you'd like to share as well. Oh, sorry, it's called Check in 10. I'm Christina Sprader. I'm the Director of Learning Strategies from EdTech Team, at EdTech Team. I just, sometimes go by Check in 10. Yes, Holly, we will send the recording of all of these after. So we've got, and again, I should mention this, we mentioned this at the beginning, there's 3 parts to this today. This is part 1. There are 2 more 90-minute sessions that Ryan will be hosting. Ryan shared, and Ryan, it might be good to just, can you go back on your slide deck to the slide that showed the imagined statements as well as that kind of outlined the rest of today. So for today, we've really designed this around some of our vision for what learning can look like. And we've got 3 parts to that. One is really focused on the learner and thinking about the learners we have in our systems. So that's what this part has been designed around. The next part that'll start in about a half hour is all focused on learning and what are we learning in our schools. And then the last part will be focused on learner-centered ecosystems. So how are we designing ecosystems that support learners and learning? We will be sending a recording out to anybody who has registered for all 3 of those sessions.
And I would just add, sort of the idea here of setting the tone this morning as we think about really leading and learning without boundaries is we have a great opportunity ahead of us, as I mentioned, but thinking about the learner and start that, as we really think about a learner-centered system, we really want to think about the learner. And I just want to thank everybody for participating and sharing their ideas, because across, as you can see, across, everybody's districts, and we span sort of the East and West Coast here in North and South with even our participation today, we're really thinking about the learner, but our system was really designed sometimes to be so heavy emphasis on the learning. So part 2 is going to get in not only into the learning, but a learning experience that allows students to learn those skills and be nurtured as a powerful learner, while they're learning. So the key word in this is going to be while, and I saw in the chat section about how do we do this in the standards-based era and the push of some of these restrictions at the same time balancing out with nurturing. And that's what really the next section is going to get into, is these powerful learning experiences and the shift that we need to make in not only our thinking, but the shift we can make in some of our instructional strategies to do that. So great question in there as well in the chat. And I think Kim had put that piece in there about really sort of putting students in the driver's seat. So that's really what part 2 is going to get into, and part 3 will really get into doing it systemically. It is not simple work, and it's always been, but at the same time, the fact that so many industries, including education, have been shifted beyond our traditional boundaries, it's a chance for us to continue to move forward. And with almost every family and every student learning to learn beyond the school boundaries, it's a great opportunity to really think about what some of those skills are that students are using, some of the strategies that teachers are using, and how we can do some of these things systemically moving forward. Thank you, Holly. It looks like Holly's looking at opening up a center. It's great to hear. And the more we hear about just this learner-centered piece and who that learner is, again, it goes back to that core idea of what does a powerful learner look like, and how can they be nurtured and developed to take on whatever learning is in front of them. Thank you, Holly.
Yeah, and that makes me think, as we're wrapping up, as we have 2 minutes till we're officially going to take a break for about a half hour, I would love for you to drop in the chat as you're ready to leave. What's one thought that is resonating with you from the past hour and a half, or how long you've been in here? What's one thought that you will be continuing to think about, or an idea? So if you could just drop something in from this time, it would be great to see what some of the connections were. And then from there, we'll go ahead, we'll sit on here for another couple minutes if any questions come up. Otherwise, we will be back at 9 o'clock Pacific, 11 o'clock Central, 12 o'clock Eastern to start the next 90 minutes. So really glad that you joined us this morning, and we're ready for the rest of the day to keep diving deeper. And thank you, Ryan, for kicking us off with some good thoughts.
Oops, I had it muted. Of course, thank you, Christina. Thank you, EdTech team. And thank you, everybody, for making it a great day of sharing and learning. I see the chat's going to continue, but again, if you need anything, you reach out to us directly as well. As you know, we touch the surface on these things, and our goal of this is to do an intro of a lot of these topics, but to go much deeper with these and give whatever resources and support we can. So thanks for the questions too. We'll see you in a little bit.
Thanks, everybody.